I overheard my own daughter laughing with her friends, saying I was in the way of her new life. She didn't even see me sitting there, listening. My chest tightened, my hands went cold, but I didn't say a word, at least not yet. For years, I'd supported her dreams, helped her through every setback, quietly gave her everything she asked for. And now? She was tossing me aside like I didn't matter, like my presence was a nuisance. In that moment, I made a decision. She thought she could move forward without me. She was about to learn she couldn't. I could hear every word, crystal clear, like nails scraping across a chalkboard. "He's always in the way," she said, laughing with that sharp, careless tone that made my blood boil. "I can't do anything without him hovering over me." The sound of her heels clicking against the floor as she paced the room, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the stale coffee in the kitchen. It all burned into my mind. I sat there, silent, pretending not to notice, letting her words sink into my chest. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the fury I held in check. For years, I had poured everything into her life, the down payments, the advice, the countless sacrifices she didn't even know about. And here she was, mocking me behind my back, like I was some obstacle she could just sidestep. I wanted to shout, to storm in and demand respect, but I didn't. I had learned long ago that quiet observation was far more powerful than sudden rage. I leaned back in my chair, letting her chatter fade into the background, my mind already racing. Every word she spoke, every careless laugh, fed a plan forming in the shadows. She thought I didn't notice. She thought I was just an old man fading into the background of her bright, exciting life. But I was very much here, and the moment she realized that what she saw as in the way was actually the hand that had built her dreams. That moment would be unforgettable. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, quietly watching someone you've sacrificed for dismiss you, what would you do? Type it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you think I should teach her a lesson she won't forget, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this. Don't forget to subscribe too, because I've got more stories where I turned the tables on people who underestimated me. Trust me, these are lessons they'll remember for a lifetime. I suppose I should start from the beginning, to make sense of why her words cut me so deeply. I wasn't always the quiet man people see now, hunched over in my chair, quietly watching life pass me by. I built a life filled with work, sacrifices, and dreams, not just for myself, but for her. When she was little, I remember her small hands clinging to mine as we walked to the park. She had that wild, unstoppable energy, always running ahead, yet always looking back for me. I worked long hours to give her everything she wanted, the toys, the lessons, the little trinkets she insisted she needed. Even then, I could see in her eyes that spark, the same spark I recognized in myself. She was ambitious, determined, and honestly, a little stubborn. I admired that about her, even when it drove me crazy. Her mother and I split when she was just 8. I could have let bitterness take over, could have walked away, leaving her to fend for herself. But I didn't. I made sure she never felt the void of absence, at least not in material ways. I stayed late at work, sometimes skipping meals, just to pay for her piano lessons, her school trips, and eventually her first car. I wanted her to believe she could do anything she set her mind to. There were nights I'd lie awake, listening to her bedroom door creak as she practiced her sketches or whispered to her dolls. I could hear her tiny voice, soft and determined, plotting out imaginary futures. I remember thinking, I will make these futures possible for you, no matter what it costs me. And I did. I co-signed her first apartment lease after college, lent her money to fix her car when she got stuck on the highway late at night, and even helped her invest in her first small business venture. Every time I helped, I felt a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't demand applause, until now. Because now, decades later, here she was, talking about me as if I was some obstacle. He's in the way. He's holding me back. That same little girl I had stayed up all night to comfort, who I had guided through scraped knees, heartbreaks, and failed attempts, was dismissing me like I was nothing. I can still smell the faint aroma of the vanilla-scented candle she always kept on her dresser, the same one that burned while she did her homework, long after bedtime. It's funny how scents carry memory. I remember bringing it home from a small boutique when she was 13, just because it made her smile. I see now that those small acts, those tiny sacrifices I made, became invisible to her. She never saw them as acts of love. She saw them as expected. Entitlement had crept in quietly, unnoticed, until this moment. It wasn't just the money, either. It was the trust, the emotional investment. I spent hours listening to her worries, offering guidance she often ignored. She would come home from college, stressed about exams or friendship drama, and I would sit beside her, offering advice, even if it wasn't the most exciting thing for me. I was her sounding board, her safe place, and she paid me back in whispers behind my back, calling me in the way. I thought about all the dinners we shared, the birthdays I celebrated alone after her mother left, making sure she felt surrounded by love. I remembered the day she graduated, tears in my eyes as I watched her toss her cap into the air. I made this possible, I told myself then, proud and satisfied. But now, standing here, eavesdropping on her laughter, I felt a chill crawl over my spine. All that care, all that sacrifice. What did it mean to her? Nothing. Even the small daily routines carried memories. The kitchen smelled faintly of the bread I baked every Sunday, the same bread she once said was her favorite. I had learned to make it for her while she was in school, sneaking in a bit of sugar and honey to make it special. Every loaf was a small gesture of love, unnoticed, unappreciated, and now seemingly meaningless. I realized then that this wasn't just a moment of disrespect. It was the culmination of years of subtle dismissal. The little sighs, the rolling of eyes, the casual disregard for my advice, all added up to this final statement. I am in the way. In that instant, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, steadier. A recognition that love alone would not command respect, and that her words, sharp as they were, demanded action. And so I sat there, breathing quietly, letting the echoes of her laughter sink into my bones. I let her believe she was untouchable, that her dreams were unstoppable, that I was powerless. Little did she know, the foundation of those dreams, everything she assumed was hers to claim, rested in my hands. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in years, a smile crept across my face. Not the warm, indulgent smile of a grandfather. No. This was the calm, deliberate smile of a man who had realized that respect had to be earned, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons are learned not through words, but through consequence. I already knew what I would do. She would find out, in her own time, exactly what it meant to have someone she dismissed quietly holding all the cards. And when that moment came, she would remember every small kindness I had given her, and how quickly it could be withdrawn, because love, it seemed, had its limits when it met betrayal, and I had reached mine. After that day, I couldn't just sit quietly anymore. Her words had planted a seed, a cold, persistent thought that grew with every interaction. She didn't stop at calling me in the way to her friends. Over the next few weeks, I noticed little things, subtle, yet cutting. She started dismissing my advice outright, even in front of her partner. She'd roll her eyes when I suggested practical solutions, shrug off my reminders about contracts or deadlines, and act as if I didn't know the first thing about the world she claimed to conquer. It began to sting, not just emotionally but practically. I had invested in her plans, co-signed her mortgage, backed her renovations, even lent her money to cover unexpected expenses. All of it built her dream home, a place she boasted about to anyone who would listen. And now, it was like I was invisible. Worse, she bragged about how free she would finally be once she no longer had to answer to me, even though I was still footing part of the bill. The audacity burned me from the inside out. The first complication came during a casual dinner with her partner, a man I had always tried to like, always tried to accept as family. He laughed at her remarks, joined in, and the weight of it struck me like a hammer. They treated me as though I was a ghost haunting their perfect, planned-out lives. I wanted to leave the room and slam the door behind me, but instead, I smiled quietly, nodding along while my mind raced. Every laugh, every careless word became fuel for what I began planning. Then came the second betrayal, subtler but sharper. She started forgetting to include me in important discussions about the house or finances, pretending I had no say. Emails marked "for your input" went unanswered. Phone calls were ignored. I watched her meetings with contractors, her excited videos posted online, and realized she was constructing her future on the assumption that I would continue supporting her blindly. It wasn't just disrespect anymore, it was entitlement compounded by ignorance. Even neighbors began noticing the tension. One afternoon, Mrs. Carlyle, my next-door neighbor and longtime friend, stopped by for tea. I confided in her quietly, trying to contain the anger that simmered beneath my calm exterior. She gave me a knowing look, shaking her head slightly. "You've always done everything for her," she said, voice low. "But she's blind to it. You have to show her that what she takes for granted isn't endless." Her words echoed in my mind, striking chords of both warning and inspiration. I nodded politely, sipping my tea, but inside I was already imagining the steps I could take. The complications didn't stop there. She began pushing harder, making comments in front of friends about how independent she was, how she didn't need anyone to hold her back. The irony was deliciously cruel. Every mention of freedom and moving forward felt like a personal challenge. My investments, my help, the foundation I had quietly provided for her life, it all hung by my invisible hand. The more she boasted, the clearer it became. I had the power to redefine her reality with a single move. By the time the weekend rolled around, she had scheduled a meeting with the mortgage broker and contractors, chatting animatedly about upgrades and design changes. She didn't expect me to intervene. She didn't even think I could. But I observed silently, making notes, calculating options, and feeling a strange, cold satisfaction in knowing that patience and planning could be more powerful than confrontation. Every smile she flashed at her friends, every nod from the broker, every casual glance at her phone, all of it became data for the plan I was forming. I began drafting a strategy. I would withdraw my backing, slowly, carefully, without warning. But it couldn't appear sudden or petty. It had to be precise, impactful, and irreversible. She thought she could move forward without considering me. She thought she was untouchable. I decided then that I would teach her a lesson not with anger, not with words, but with the very thing she valued most, her carefully constructed future. And yet, as I sat in my chair late that night, listening to the faint hum of her distant laughter drifting through the open window, a tiny voice inside me warned, timing was everything. Too soon, and she might plead, negotiate, or manipulate. Too late, and the opportunity might pass. I had to be surgical, deliberate, and patient. The tension grew each day. Every invitation to lunch she ignored, Every question she brushed off, every whispered laugh behind my back. It all added layers to the plan forming in my mind. She was building her dreams on assumptions that I would continue to fund her life unquestioningly. And she had no idea that the foundation she relied on was about to vanish. By the end of the week, I knew exactly what I would do, and the first piece of the puzzle was already in motion. The daughter, who thought she had a clear path forward, was about to find herself at a dead end, and the man she trusted to support her dreams wouldn't be there to catch her. Not because I wanted revenge, but because respect, once lost, can only be restored through consequence. And so the stage was set. She was moving confidently, blissfully unaware of the storm about to descend. She had taken me for granted, assumed I was powerless, and for that, she was about to learn that even the quietest hand can hold the heaviest weight. I spent the next few days in quiet observation. I didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation was for amateurs, and I'm not an amateur. I'm a man who has spent decades quietly building, calculating, and waiting for the right moment. Every word she spoke, every plan she made, every confident stride toward her dream home became fuel for what I was about to do. The first step was subtle. I contacted the mortgage broker, the very same one she had been emailing, asking questions she assumed I would approve. I phrased my words carefully, neutral, almost indifferent. "I'm reviewing my accounts," I said. "I'll confirm the final approval shortly." Nothing alarming on the surface, nothing to alert her. But I knew how this tiny pause would ripple through her carefully scheduled timeline. She had no idea that her security, her forward momentum, was about to stall. Next, I began subtly undermining her plans without her noticing. I called contractors to confirm timelines, asked detailed questions about budgets, materials, permits. All normal, right? She had always trusted me to handle the heavy lifting, to smooth over problems, and to be her safety net. Now, each inquiry I made planted tiny seeds of doubt in the systems she relied on. By the time she checked her emails, the responses would appear delayed or flagged with questions she couldn't answer without my approval. I also made sure to document everything carefully. Every call, every email, every step she had taken, assuming my backing was in place. I wasn't doing this out of spite alone. I wanted her to understand, when the moment came, the full measure of what she had taken for granted. She needed to see that her independence was an illusion, sustained entirely by my quiet willingness to support her. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at home. I smiled, offered advice she ignored, listened to her chatter about paint colors, landscaping, and furniture. Every laugh, every excited plan made my calm expression more deliciously ironic. She believed I was powerless, compliant, and soft. And she was right, until the moment came when all that trust would vanish. I reached out to a few trusted friends, people who had witnessed her entitlement, people who understood the subtle power of a quiet, well-timed lesson. I spoke in hypothetical terms, of course, never revealing my intent. Sometimes people need to learn that independence comes with responsibility, I'd say casually, watching their reactions. A slight nod here, a knowing smile there. I didn't need anyone to act for me. I only needed them to confirm that my plan, as cruel as it might seem to some, would have the maximum impact. The most delicate part of the setup was timing. I couldn't withdraw my financial support too early. She might panic, plead, or manipulate her way around it. But if I waited too long, she could finalize her purchase, and the lesson would be meaningless. Every day, I monitored her movements, her calls, her emails, her excited glances at furniture catalogs. I was learning her rhythm, her expectations, and her blind spots. By midweek, I was ready for the final step before the reveal. I requested a formal account review with her mortgage broker, framing it as routine. "I just want to make sure everything is aligned," I said. The broker assured me she was unaware of the review, confirming that my timing would hit her exactly where it hurt, the heart of her plans. I smiled quietly, sipping my tea, thinking how blissfully unaware she was, how every dream she had was teetering on the edge of collapse. I also prepared for the aftermath. I made sure she wouldn't have a backup plan, that no one could swoop in and save her at the last moment. Friends, relatives, even contractors were all subtly reminded that decisions required my approval. By the time she realized her path was blocked, it would be too late to salvage anything. And she would know, unmistakably, that the hand that had built her life was now the hand that could halt it. Every step was deliberate, every pause intentional. I was not angry. I was surgical. I was not vengeful in a petty way. I was strategic. Her words had been cruel, dismissive, and entitled, but my response would not be public shame or a heated argument. It would be quiet, elegant, irreversible. And so, I waited, watching, smiling, counting the moments until the dominoes fell. She had no idea that the very foundation she leaned on was about to vanish. She thought she was unstoppable, free to move forward. She thought her grandfather, the man who had quietly carried her through every hardship, had no power over her now. But I knew better. And when the time came, she would understand exactly what it meant to be in the way, not by insult, but by the undeniable, inescapable consequence of her own words. The day finally arrived. She woke up buzzing with excitement, bouncing through the house with her phone in hand, talking about signing the final papers for her dream home. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched her movements. She didn't even glance my way. That overconfidence, it was the sweetest part. I called the mortgage broker just as she had planned to finalize the deal. "Everything's ready," she had said earlier, expecting my usual silent approval. But this time, I said, calmly and deliberately, "I've reviewed the finances, and I can't continue backing the loan. The account is frozen until further notice." You could almost hear the pause on the other end of the line. The broker stammered, unsure what to say, and I let the silence linger. Every second stretched long enough to feel like an eternity. Meanwhile, she arrived at the bank, glowing and confident. I followed quietly behind, not as a threat, but as a shadow she hadn't noticed. When she opened the door and met the teller, she smiled brightly, ready to sign, only to be told that the final approval could not be processed. Her brow furrowed, confusion mixing with disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Everything's ready." The teller explained that the primary guarantor had frozen the account pending review. She turned to me, panic in her eyes. "Grandpa, this has to be a mistake," she said, grabbing my arm, pleading. I smiled quietly. "No mistake," I said. "You called me in the way. You said I blocked your life. I just thought it was time to test that theory." Her face went pale. Her confident, energetic posture crumbled. I could see the realization dawning. Every word, every brag, every laugh that had belittled me came back to her now as a weight she couldn't lift. She tried to call her partner, thinking maybe he could bail her out. He shook his head, equally stunned. Even the contractors she had lined up were informed, courtesy of my earlier quiet reminders, that nothing could proceed without cleared funding. Every single piece of her plan stalled, frozen in midair. She had no way forward. Her hands trembled as she flipped through her paperwork, trying to find some loophole, some last-minute fix. But I had anticipated every angle. Every email, every form, every procedural detail had been locked down weeks ago. She was trapped, not by threats or anger, but by the very system she had taken for granted. The most satisfying moment came when she finally slumped into a chair, exhausted, defeated, and utterly speechless. She had built dreams on my support, never thinking I could, or would, withdraw it. And now she realized just how dependent she had been, and how foolish she had been to assume her independence was absolute. I let her stew for a moment, watching as frustration, fear, and regret mingled on her face. Then I spoke, soft but firm. "You said I was in the way," I reminded her, "so I removed the path you assumed was yours. Life isn't just about freedom, it's about respect. You forgot that." She opened her mouth, likely to argue, to beg, to try and twist words in her favor, but there was nothing left to negotiate. She had lost leverage, and she knew it. The irony of her situation, built entirely on her own hubris, was deliciously clear. After a few tense minutes, she finally looked away, tears brimming, anger mixed with helplessness. I didn't gloat, at least not out loud. I let the silence speak. It was more powerful than any lecture, any shouted reprimand. She had learned her lesson without a single raised voice, through consequence, the way real lessons are learned. Even later, when she tried to appeal to friends or relatives for sympathy or help, I had already ensured that the facts were clear. Everyone knew she had been warned, that her plans had relied on assumptions, and that my actions were both measured and justified. I had transformed the in-the-way insult into a reality she could neither deny nor escape. That evening, she sat quietly, staring at blueprints and estimates, the energy and excitement that had carried her for weeks, replaced by hesitation and reflection. She understood now what it meant to rely on someone and take them for granted, and she would remember it for a long time. I sipped my coffee and watched her, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. This wasn't just revenge, it was a lesson in awareness, humility, and respect. She had assumed power and independence were hers for the taking. I had shown her that real independence requires more than words. It requires accountability and a recognition of the foundations upon which your life is built. As she finally looked at me, silence stretching between us, I smiled gently. Not cruelly, not vindictively, just the quiet smile of someone who had acted deliberately and wisely. She would rebuild eventually, but she would do so with a newfound respect, and that was worth far more than any argument I could have had. Days passed, and the house remained out of reach, a silent reminder of what she had taken for granted. I watched her slowly pick up the pieces, no longer rushing, no longer assuming everything would bend to her will. She had learned the hard way that life doesn't hand out freedom without respect and responsibility. For me, the satisfaction wasn't in punishment, it was in balance restored. I hadn't humiliated her publicly, nor had I raised my voice. I had simply acted, letting consequence speak louder than words ever could. That evening, as she quietly organized her next steps, I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and smiled. She finally understood that some barriers exist not to harm, but to teach, and that sometimes the ones we think are in the way are the very people keeping our lives on course.